And let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, it is again a Sabbath day for which we give you profound thanks. We thank you that you knew us better than we know ourselves, even to this day, and you gave us a day for rest. We don't always use it. You gave us a day to remember your grace, and we don't always use that either. But we ask for you to give us your gift of rest and of renewal on this Sabbath day. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, in whom you were reconciling the world to yourself. Amen. Today we're in session 2. I might say a couple other things about where we're going. You haven't seen at the end my usual where we've been and where we're going, so you can see things in perspective. It's there today. And I can also tell you where we're going from here. We have Consecration Sunday on the next Sunday, the 22nd or whatever it is, the 20th of October. And then on the 27th, we have a big Reformation celebration with dancing and singing and all that. And I have a presentation to make about Martin Luther. And then I'm going to skip town for a couple weeks, going over to the Holy Land again. And we'll be there for 2.5 weeks. And Pastor Fritz Foltz will be with us. And our series will be continuing the Reformation theme into November. Reformers we ought to know. Most everybody believes that Martin Luther is the key reformer. Well, frankly, if you see him in the chronological order of reformers, he's right square in the middle. And there's about 15 significant reformers. We're not going to try to do 15, but we're going to do 4 that Lutherans ought to know something about. And so Pastor Fritz will do the first 2, and I'll come home and finish the last 2. And then we'll do an Advent Christmas series, the fullness of which isn't spelled out yet. But that's kind of where we're going. And since we create all this kind of from scratch and with your recommendations in the hallways and other such things, it always requires some sitting down and thinking, and how are we going to put all this together? And some days it comes easily, and other days it's really tough. Let's go back a little bit and try to recall where we were last week when we talked about how did it get this way. And you'll remember we talked about Jesus saying, I've come that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. He's actually talking about his sheep in the fold, but of course we are in Christ's sheepfold. He is the good shepherd. And so therefore he's talking about us. Secondly, we talked about Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, who consistently talked about living not beyond our means, but beyond ourselves. He consistently said, the search for the pursuit of happiness is doomed. We're guaranteed in our constituting documents life, liberty, and the, quote, pursuit of happiness. And Viktor Frankl, speaking to American University some years ago, it had to be because he died in 1977, but some years ago, he said, I don't want to tangle with your constitutional documents about which you're justly proud, but the pursuit of happiness is doomed to fail from the outset, because happiness is always the byproduct of something else. And he spells out that something else, and we shared it last week. This is just trying to get us all on the same course. And he finally says, it comes from giving ourselves to people and causes beyond ourselves. That's where happiness comes. And of course, we mentioned also reality therapy and the great principle there that mental health really begins not in regressing us to the tragedies of our childhood or the traumas of our childhood, but in fact coming to the realization that we are personally worthwhile and that others around us also believe us to be worthwhile. That's where stable mental health is found. That's saying exactly the same thing in different words that Frankl was saying. And we talked about all this, and we talked about living not beyond our means, which is what our culture does, but beyond, especially our government, which is just going to shut down because nobody knows how to run it. I don't want to go there. Lord, why did I even mention that? I think there ought to be a campaign that we will unelect every seated congressman in the United States and start over. But that's not the process here. I don't think either side has shown the ability to govern with statesmanship. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Bottom line was, we're called to live beyond ourselves, something greater than ourselves, as you'll see in the second paragraph next to the last line. Franco is sounding a lot like Jesus. And remember, Jesus said, he who seeks to save his life loses it. He who loses his life for my sake and for the gospel finds it. That's living beyond our immediate selves again. Do you hear what I'm trying to say? It's all going together. That this me first of our culture is eating at us like a cancer. In the 20th and 21st centuries, our sense of living abundantly is just diametrically opposite from what Frankl is saying, and what reality therapy is saying, and what Jesus is saying. And, it's a matter of gathering all we can as fast as we can and holding on to as much as we can. And the sense is that, folks in their golden years legitimately have a concern that maybe the money will run out before they do. There is a sense of being responsible. And we're not talking about accountability, but there is ultimately, finally, no way for us to pile up enough resource that we can cover every disaster, a flood, cancer, and a whole series of other things that we simply cannot ever amass enough to change. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So the idea that we can finally, if we hold on to everything and give up nothing, then we can, maybe, God willing, God's help, have enough to struggle through. And so our economy encourages us, to get, as I've said here, the idea of ingathering of wealth and abundance of more and more things, trophy houses, automobiles, the latest technology, and sufficiently large investments and financial access accounts to provide absolute security for whatever comes. And the fact of the matter is, we can't. We can be responsible, we can be accountable, but we cannot be independent. That finally comes from our trust in God, and we'll get to that. And you remember the rich young man coming to Jesus. The rich young man coming to Jesus, and it's one of the texts we read in our text reading for this week. And he says, I've kept all the commandments since my youth. And Luke tells us Jesus looked at the man, kind of liked him. And then he said, what more must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. Does that really mean that Jesus doesn't want any of us to have wealth? He wants us all to be homeless. He wants us all to give up what we have. And I don't think that's what he's meaning at all. What he's doing is this. Listen closely. When he said to the man, you've done all these things, it was T.S. Eliot who wrote in Murder in the Cathedral, the highest of all treason, and many of you know this quote, the highest of all treason is to do the right things for the wrong reasons. And what Jesus perceived in this man is he had kept the commandments, not because he loved God, not because he loved his fellow man. Remember the commandments, there's 10 of them. 4, maybe 3.5, deal with our relationship with God. They're vertical. You should love the Lord your God, that kind of thing. But then the other 6.5 or 7 are what we might call horizontal. They deal with how we live with one another. We don't lie, we don't cheat, we don't steal, all those kinds of things. We don't commit adultery, we don't take our neighbor's wealth. All these kind of things that have to do with how, and a man says, I've kept all these since my youth. And what Jesus perceives is, he may have done this, although few of us do. But he may have done this, but when it came to finding who his God was, he wasn't doing this to be righteous with God. Who was his God? His wealth. His wealth. And he went away sad with his head down because he had great wealth. Now, a writer in Generosity, a little book called Generosity, has a paragraph that speculates, how would it have been if the fellow went home, prayed about it, thought about it, and came back the next morning and said, Jesus, you're right, I've decided to do what you told me. Well, wouldn't that be a neat story? It would be so neat that somebody would have told us if he did. So the probability is he didn't. So we get to this issue today, which is the topic of the day. Why is this so difficult? Why is this so difficult for us? And that takes us back to that original question. And why is it so different for affluent folk, as we say, like most of us, to get into heaven? Or more immediately, why is it so difficult to enter joyously the kind of life that God himself lives? St. Augustine, says it very clearly, our hearts are not at rest until we're at rest with God. Now, if that's where the rest is, why is it so difficult to do the kinds of things God does, spending himself, herself, if it makes you happy? By the way, I said that when I was interim bishop in Delaware, Maryland Synod, and a congregation charged me with heresy. But seriously, they put it on the internet and all of that kind of thing, because I said laughingly from the rostrum at the Synod Assembly, God, he, or she, if it makes you feel better. On that phrase, they charged me with heresy. Well, you can do that too if you want. But the point is, God has, from the beginning, poured himself out for us. And if that's not generosity, while we were yet sinners, Paul writes marvelously in the Epistle to the Romans, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We didn't deserve it. And Paul marvels. He said, for a righteous man, one might consider dying. But the marvel of it all is that while we were yet sinners, not righteous, Christ died for us. God has this sense of pouring out himself for us. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Well, if we are most at peace when our hearts are with God, what in the world is making this so difficult? Why is it difficult for us to simply overflow with generosity? Now, I know everybody here overflows with generosity, or you wouldn't be here. I remember Archbishop Hickey. I was speaking for the development of a brand new Roman Catholic parish down in Culvert County years ago. And Archbishop Hickey was there, and he made a little speech before I spoke. And it was a huge banquet. And it was, to kick off a drive for building a new church. And Archbishop Hickey got up. He said, I'm truly, truly confused. He said, you all knew when you came this was about money, but you're smiling anyway. I'm totally confused. At any rate, why does Jesus tell this fellow to give it all up, throw it away? Because he was identifying not the evil of wealth per se, but he was identifying what happens to us when we start to worry about protecting it. He went right to the heart of this young man. And then he turned to his disciples, and that should have been part of what was quoted in our book, and it wasn't, but I don't care enough to write the author about it. But I'll tell you, he went then to the point to his disciples, he said off to the side, it's not easy for a rich man to get into heaven. And then he followed it up by saying, and you all know it because we remember from Sunday school days, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. And the disciples said, we're lost. And Jesus said, but with God all things are possible. We're back to that grace again. At any rate, is there something about money that corrupts us? The writer of 1 Timothy says, the love of money is the root of all evil. But of course, what it's mostly quoted as, money is the root of all evil. The three first words are critically important. The love of money is the root of all evil. When the love of money begins to step in front of our love for God, of our hunger to be at rest in God, then it becomes very evil. Money is neutral. Wealth is neutral. It's what we do with it. Consider atomic energy. It can be used. It can be used to generate enough electricity to light a hospital, an entire city, to do all kinds of medical operations and cures. But much more money has been spent on weaponizing with atomic energy around the world than has been spent on learning how to live with it safely. But atomic energy is not evil. The same thing's true about money. It's not what money is, just like it's not what atomic energy is. It's what we do with it, and in turn, what it ultimately does to us. Why are the Israelis so afraid of the Iranians getting a nuclear weapon? Well, of course, they vowed to destroy Israel. And Israel is so small, properly placed, it only would take one. And it will be vaporized. So that you can use this awesome power to improve society or to destroy it. Nathan is told about a hermit who knew everything. And you just couldn't fool him. And the two boys said, we know how to fool him. We're going to go up to his cave, and we're going to have a sparrow in our hand behind our back. And if we say, old man, we have a sparrow in our hand. Is it alive or is it dead? If he says it's alive, we'll crush it. If he says dead, we'll let it go. So they go up to the old man, and they say, old man, you know everything. We have a bird in our hand. Tell me, is it alive or is it dead? And the old man smiled. He said, it's up to you, my son. It's up to you. This is what it is with wealth. Not that wealth is evil, but that wealth can detract us, distract us, sidetrack us, and otherwise take us away from the focus of why God put us here, and that was to love one another as God has loved us. Bishop Allain, now deceased, Bishop Allain, who died in the 1980s, I think. What did I have got down? In 1977. I told you Frankel died then. He died much more recently. Bishop Allain died in 1977, but he was a bishop in Sweden. And he wrote a book that became a continuing bestseller called The Faith of the Christian Church. He wrote it in 1930, but then we were just getting caught up in the rise of the Third Reich and its tremendous influence in the Scandinavian peninsulas. And so it didn't get to the United States until after the war. It was translated into English in 1948. And Bishop Allain talked about taking the leap of faith. He said, you know, reason, in many things as it relates to our faith, reason can walk us so far. But then, because God is so much huger than we are, then we come to the point where human reason cannot go any further, and we have to take the leap of faith. And he talks about that leap of faith. And what's in this chasm that we're trying to leap over? Fear, worry, distrust, greed. We can think of other things as well that are part of our broken nature with which we all struggle. Would Ted and Doris like to have a home at the shore? Well, I think so if you didn't have to cross the river and be in that long line every Friday afternoon, maybe. But not if it changes who we are. But it could really get to be, because you see, I wanted to be in the Navy as a chaplain. And since chaplain's commissioned officer, and since commissioned officers have to pass higher health standards, and since my eyes weren't very good, I couldn't be a lieutenant in the Navy. Therefore, I could not be a chaplain. So, when I retired, I fully intended to buy a couple of boats and start my own Navy. I was a way to deal with that. But ultimately, we come in all issues of faith to taking that leap of faith beyond which our human reason cannot go. How can there be three persons and only one God? I can't understand that. St. Patrick picked a three-leaf clover, okay, and that works for some. I simply understand that God has shown himself to me as Father, he's shown himself to me as the Son in Jesus Christ, and he's given me the Holy Spirit in my baptism. So there are three kind of, Luther called the masks of God. But explain it? No, I can't do that. I finally take the leap of faith. God has said it. I believe it. That settles it. Well, when it comes to generosity, that also requires a leap of faith. Because, as I've said, we do worry, how much do we need, and all that kind of thing. And greed is also a part of it. We'd like to have more. We'd like to have more, even just a little bit more. But the little bit more always moves out here. Having a lot never becomes having enough. Have we experienced that already? Having all kinds of things is never like having enough. So, how do we deal with that? Pam was a counselor when I started Mount Luther Camp and Conference Center in Mifflinburg, Pennsylvania. On my first staff, I had high college students or graduates as counselors. They were not bed tenders. They were teachers for a solid week with a small group of 8 boys and 8 girls. And one of those counselors was a senior in college. And she used to like to tell the story when we gather when the kids were asleep in bed and the coffee machine was still on and the Archway cookies were out on the table in the dining hall. We'd all get around the table and talk about how the day went with each other, and then we'd talk about what we're going to do the next day and who needed what when, and all those kind of things. And we get into sharing stories. And Pam used to love to tell the story that she was the only person she thought in that crowd who had ever been offered, for whose hand her father had been offered, 10 white camels, a flock of sheep, and an over $1 million dowry purse. The father would have been a multimillionaire. Pam was a gorgeous young lady, both in personality and every other regard. And so she said, I'll bet nobody's been offered 10 white camels. I didn't even know there were white candles, and so I went and looked for them, and there they are on page 3. And Pam used to always say, my dad turned it down because he really reasoned it out, she'd say with a little twinkle in her eye. And she'd say, Dad decided there wasn't much market for camels in the United States, so he turned it down. But in Arab culture, that would have been a compliment. It was a compliment. The father had been working for an oil company in the Arabian Peninsula this is back when we could be there safely, in the Arabian Peninsula for years. She'd spent all her school years in that culture. And though she was therefore a marriable teenager, for whom her father was offered 10 white camels. I've been to the Holy Land more than 20 times. I've never, ever seen a white camel. But as you see on page 3, they exist. But her father turned it down, and yet, it must have been just a moment when he said, my daughter will have this wonderful life in this multimillionaire's sheik's house and all of that. He turned it down. Laugh as we may, there's an insidious force that makes us want to hold on to everything and to gather yet more. Remember St. Paul, I can will what is right, but I can't do it. For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil that I do not want to do is what I do. Our own Evangelical Lutheran Worship Book, which we rarely use here, in its first order for confession says, Most merciful God, we confess that we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. And if there was ever a truth spoken in our hymnal, there it is. So that this sense of being generous, not the last trip I went on, but a recent trip, we'll put it this way, to the Holy Land, which I was not managing, but which I was accompanying. I began to notice that these people who were part of that pilgrimage were never leaving a tip at the meal tables, even though the brochure had made it very clear tips were expected and they weren't part of the tour price. And I watched this for a couple days, and we're traveling each day in still what we would call serious poverty, particularly in the areas of the Palestinian Authority. And just the total living standard in the Holy Land is not nearly where most of us are. And I'm watching retired people whose wealth is secure leaving not a nickel. Not a nickel. So after one meal, I unfolded the tour brochure and said, I need to read this around our table because this is embarrassing for us all. And I read about tips. Well, they're being paid, was the response. Yeah, well, not much. So after we got over the anger, and there was real anger from people that have more than enough wealth, they started leaving tips. If I saw as much as $1 total on the table, it was a special day. And I would go up to my room, and the steam coming out of my ears, I began leaving $10 and $15 on the table because I was embarrassed that even confronted, there was no willingness to be generous. And I'm not talking about uneducated. I'm not talking about unskilled. These are all professionals retired comfortably. One old gentleman, having, of course, in neither the Palestinian Authority area or in the Holy Land of Israel are you going to ever get bacon for breakfast. And after about 5 days, he said, when I get home, I'm going to have my wife fry me up a whole pound of bacon. All at one time, he said in his frustration. But these were good people, but not generous people, even though they were looking at poverty every day. What is it? What is it makes us clinch? And I know I'm singing to the choir this morning, but you know that I'm telling you the truth about the world around us. What is it that makes us clinch so hard? Well, It's one of those places where, as Bishop Allain says, we need to make the leap of faith. We need to make the leap of faith to be generous, assuming that God will match and overmatch our life of generosity. I believe that. I believe that. But it's a leap of faith. It's not rational to say that the more we give away, the more God gives us. Yes?
There's something in the Protestant work ethic which suggests to us that poor people are poor because they're lazy, and therefore you're not going to give them any money, because if they'd work, they wouldn't be poor. And our Protestant work
I think people say that all the time. I think you've hit it right on the head. The trouble is, okay, I'll stand here and watch the bus stop while the man starves. Can I do that? Not in Christ. I don't care whether he works or not. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Therein dies that ethic. Do you follow what I'm trying to say? But you're exactly right. We have the feeling that if people work, but you know, there was a great article in the Washington Post last week about the Navy Yard shootings. And it was written by Krauthammer, who I read periodically. And I didn't realize he's a psychiatrist. And he said 30 years ago, when I was in the emergency room in a Boston hospital, if a man came in saying he was hearing voices and feeling vibrations through the wall and people were chasing him, I'd have kept him in the hospital for 14 days of observation. The laws don't let us do that anymore. Now, that meant he did harm to himself. He's dead now. He did harm to 11 others. We have become so concerned about protecting each one's individual freedoms that we can't even protect them. That was the point of his article, and I thought, wow, somebody needed to say that, you know. Somebody needed to say that. But at any rate, yeah, you're exactly right. That's what we say. But the issue is there aren't enough jobs. There aren't enough skilled people. And the other thing he said that I don't want to forget was better than 75% of the homeless people sleeping on steam grates have some serious psychological and emotional issues that keeps them from being able to cope and function in our culture. So it's complex. I don't have to answer the question of the man's I don't have to answer the question of the man's competence. I have to answer the question, when I was hungry, you fed me. Naked, you clothed me. Homeless, you took me in. Years ago at St. Luke, we're going to take in homeless off the street and house them at St. Luke as part of a county-wide program. And I had a committee of 4 of our very proper and influential women come to see me as senior pastor. And they said, the minute they walk in this building, we're walking out. And I listened to them for a while. I said, you know, I don't understand homelessness, and I'm still part of that Protestant ethic thing about working too. I don't understand any of this. But I am under the mandate of Jesus Christ, and so are you. And he said, when I was hungry, you fed me. Naked, you clothed me. Homeless, you took me in. If you can get me under that, ladies, I'll walk out with you. Well, the people came. They never left. And it was the most popular program we ever did at St. Luke. We had food to give away. So many people brought in casseroles and this kind of thing. But we have to challenge the kinds of thinking that do that. So now, what do? We have to step toward that edge that Bishop Allain talks about, that leap of faith, and talk about the risk of generosity. You know, can we afford it? Or maybe the right question is, can we not afford it. Someone once said, worry is like sitting on a hot stove without getting up. Worry is worrying without doing anything about it. Well, standing at the edge of the precipice and not taking the leap of faith is the same as the worrier that sits on the hot stove. You have to do something. The leap of faith is really a leap of trust. How much do I trust God? Faith is not believing God. James tells us in the 2nd chapter, the demons believe and they tremble. Believing in God is not the same thing as faith. The biblical term for faith is trust. There's this marvelous passage in Hebrews where the writer of Hebrews says, beginning in the 11th chapter, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the confidence of things not yet seen. The willingness to jump by faith. And then previous chapter and from there it goes on by faith, and it talks about all the great people in the Old Testament. Comes right through the history of the Old Testament. By faith, Abraham, who was already old, was told by God to go to a place which would be his inheritance, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, Abraham, who was already aged, and his wife, who's past the age of childbearing, are told they will have a son. By faith, by faith, by faith. Always this litany. The whole long chapter goes through this. And then it says, at the beginning of the 12th chapter, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses who have trusted God, let us therefore set aside every weight and every hindrance and run the race that is set before us. Trust. Bishop Arlane making the leap. I have a story for you and then I'm done. But you probably have questions and I'll, whatever, as long as we can. Faith is not what we know about God. Faith is trusting what we know about God. By the time all these series are over, my hard drive has so much stuff on it, it knows a lot of stuff. But knowing it is not faith. Story is told about a man. I didn't finish it here because I didn't want to ruin the punchline for those that read ahead. Story is told about a man who said he could walk across the widest expanse of Niagara Falls on a cable pushing a wheelbarrow. You know, P.T. Barnum used to say there's a fool born every minute. Well, this is one of those fools. And he makes so much noise about it, and people get so carried up in it, and bookies begin to make bets on it. And finally, the red tape is solved, and the cable is stretched, and the man shows up with his wheelbarrow, as does all the media. And he starts across the falls on the cable, pushing his wheelbarrow. I can't even walk any longer, putting one foot in front of the other. If they ever stop me for a sobriety test, one of you is going to have to get me out of jail. But he walks across that cable, pushing that wheelbarrow, and people's stomachs are up in their throats. The cable, of course, bounces, and the wheelbarrow wobbles. And he's very deliberate as he walks. It seems like it takes forever, and all of a sudden, he's at the other side and jumps off the cable, and this great cheer goes up, and people could breathe again. And then, to everybody's horror, he gets back on the cable and starts back. It goes a little slower this time. Of course, he's used a good deal of adrenaline and energy getting across. But finally, he gets back. And he jumps off the cable and he goes up to one of the media people. He says, "Now do you believe that I can walk across Niagara Falls on a cable pushing a wheelbarrow?" And the media fellow says, "Of course I do." He says, "You have no doubt?" He says, "No, I have no doubt." He says, "Why are you so sure?" He said, "I saw you do it twice. I know you can do it. I have no doubt." He said, "Fine, get in the wheelbarrow." Generosity. Is God asking us to get in that wheelbarrow with Him? It isn't enough to say we know God is God. It isn't enough to say God will never lie to us. It isn't enough to say we know that God can do everything. The day comes when you just got to get in the wheelbarrow. Bishop Arlene would have loved the story, but actually it was Soren Kierkegaard who told the story the first time. It's the leap of faith. Next week, we'll talk about how do you get to that faith? What are the steps we take to jump? And then, the following week, we'll talk about the joys on the other side. So those are the two places where you go. See the arthritis? I can't even get the right fingers up. That's the things we'll be talking about in the next 2 weeks. Why is it so difficult? Because we haven't dealt with the issue of really trusting God. Questions?
Isn't it the height of irony that for many people their motto is, "In God we trust"?
All others pay cash.
You would think if that was true, this would be a very generous country, knowing that God will take care of us. And yet we proclaim, "In God we trust," but we don't.
Yeah, we have a lot of slogans in the church and beyond it. The joy of living beyond oneself is simply a great joy. Our college, Roanoke College, is having a major campaign. They are now listed by U.S. News and World Report as the second of the top 10 up-and-coming liberal arts colleges in the whole country. It's our Lutheran school. And we're on a major campaign to be first. That major campaign will be a huge wellness center. That's to attract students. But then virtually gutting and rebuilding our entire science complex, new 21st century labs, this kind of thing. Keeping faculty salaries the highest among our peers. Endowment scholarships so kids like ours can still afford to go to a private school. More than 15 students, by the way, at Roanoke, of its 2,100, actually pay the tuition cost. Only 15. The college supports 50% of the tuition cost across the board out of its endowment. We want to raise the endowment. We'll make it higher. And then we want a president's fund of some money that the president, if some real thing comes up that we'd like to be in, can move to do it. When they announced it, it took my breath. $200 million. Little Roanoke College. We've already got $150 million of it. And Doris and Ted sat down and said, we want to do something significant here. And we looked at our retirement account and we said, we think we can do this. And I said, remember, there's still the seminary. Well, we'll deal with that. And every now and then I concede that when I see that big 5-figure amount headed to the college out of our retirement account, I begin to think, I guess I'll keep working at Good Shepherd. So that this issue is really an issue of God blessing us. And that a simple pastor, and I am pretty simple, could have been provided for by the church where salaries are notoriously poor over the whole guard. It's unbelievable. God has taken such care of us. Why shouldn't we give? And so we do it with joy. Not only that, we say we don't want to be in the president's circle. We don't want to be in these kind of things. I don't care if you tell somebody. But you haven't got to do these massaging things. We need to give because we want to. But that little sense of uncertainty always gnaws at you, even in the joy of giving. I'll talk about next week about that and about staying generous once we get there. So, any other questions? The issue is trust. Do you believe I can walk across? Yeah. Why are you so sure? I saw you do it twice. Get in the wheelbarrow. Do we believe that much? Thank you all very much. Could you hear all right? Could you hear all right?